Hello, my name is Krista Figgins, and I am the Director of Mission Advancement at Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma, or LASO. I am an attorney licensed in Florida and also serve as the coordinator of LASO's Disaster Legal Services programs. On behalf of LASO and Oklahoma Indian Legal Services, or OILS, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's training regarding disaster in Oklahoma and legal issues faced by disaster survivors, Disaster 101 for law students. I hope that at the end of our time together, you will have received useful information about the frequency of disaster in Oklahoma, the disaster recovery process in Oklahoma, the legal issues that can impact disaster survivors and impede their recovery, and about why it is critical to a survivor's recovery that those issues, if present, are properly addressed. I know what you must be thinking. Why would you as a law student want or need to know more about disaster impact in Oklahoma and the legal issues faced by disaster survivors? It's important because no matter if you plan to stay in Oklahoma after you graduate or you plan to move to another state, it is very likely that you will, at some point in your career, encounter a client who has a disaster-related legal issue. Disaster events happen in every state in America, impacting millions of people, and the rate of disaster impact is increasing. Using the metrics of the number of climate disasters causing at least $1 billion in damage since 1980, as well as the loss amount per capita of those disasters, Oklahoma is the 6th most disaster impacted state in America. The top 5 are Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Iowa, and Alabama. The number of disasters has increased by a factor of 5 over the 50-year period, driven by climate change, more extreme weather, and improved reporting. According to a comprehensive new report from the World Meteorological Organization, a disaster related to a weather, climate, or water hazard occurred every day on average over the past 50 years, killing 115 people and causing $202 million in losses daily. Further, in 2021, the U.S. experienced 20 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. As future members of the private bar, you are all potential future pro bono volunteers. It's my hope that by talking with you now about disaster and the legal issues that arise after disaster, we can build resilience into the future disaster legal response in Oklahoma and around the country. By knowing more about how disaster recovery works and what types of legal issues survivors typically face, you can be more resilient yourself to a disaster impact, and our private bar as a whole around the country will have more information and understanding about the need for disaster legal services. Maybe you'll find yourself volunteering here in Oklahoma or elsewhere someday in the future. I hope so. So what are disasters? The World Health Organization has defined a disaster as an occurrence disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causing a level of suffering that exceeds the capacity of adjustment of the affected community. Disasters can be natural meteorological events like tornadoes, floods, wildfires, or hurricanes. Disasters can also be man-made, such as terrorist events like the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City, chemical spills, and nuclear accidents. Disasters can also occur with the outbreak of disease like COVID-19 in 2020. There are also definitions of disaster in the Stafford Act, which was first passed by Congress in 1988. This act constitutes the statutory authority for most federal disaster response activities, especially as they pertain to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and FEMA programs. The Stafford Act defines emergency as any occasion or instance for which, in the determination of the president, federal assistance is needed to supplement state and local efforts and capabilities to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe in any part of the U.S. The Stafford Act defines a major disaster as any natural catastrophe, including any hurricane, tornado, storm, high water, wind-driven water, tidal wave, tsunami, earthquake, volcanic eruption, landslide, mudslide, snowstorm, or drought, or regardless of cause, any fire, flood, or explosion in any part of the U.S., which in the determination of the president causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant major disaster assistance under this act to supplement the efforts and available resources of states, local governments, and disaster relief organizations in alleviating the damage, loss, hardship, or suffering caused thereby. I'm sure you've heard the phrase that a disaster has been declared or presidentially declared. What exactly does that mean? After a disaster event occurs, a state or a tribal nation pursuant to the Stafford Act can ask the president to declare the event a disaster as defined by the act to engage FEMA relief and recovery services. This type of declaration activates various federal resources and disaster assistance programs. Following a declaration, FEMA programs can be turned on under the umbrella of individual assistance, which can include grants for repairs, temporary housing, disaster food assistance, and even funeral assistance. Recovery products during a declared event can also include small business administration loans, which are not only available to small businesses, they are also available to individuals and nonprofits, which are very low interest loans repayable over a 30-year period. Further, nonprofits may also be available locally to assist survivors. A disaster that does not receive a declaration, either because it wasn't asked for or because the damage and impact did not rise to the level requiring FEMA assistance for community recovery, is a non-declared disaster. These are emergencies that can and do occur every day across America, but which do not stress the ability of a local government or the state to respond. Recovery in these types of disasters depends on insurance if survivors have it, and on nonprofits with resources like the Red Cross, Catholic Charities, and the Salvation Army, to name a few. States may also declare a state of emergency. In Oklahoma, the declaration by the governor of a state of emergency activates the State Emergency Operations Plan, and amongst other powers, allows state agencies responding to that emergency to make necessary emergency acquisitions to fulfill the purposes of that emergency declaration without regard to limitations or bidding requirements on such acquisitions. These state declarations of emergency do not activate federal resources like FEMA. As I just mentioned, tribal nations may now submit a direct request for a presidential disaster declaration. This change came about in 2013 as a result of the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. This amendment provides federally recognized tribal governments the option to choose whether to make a request directly to the president for an emergency or major disaster declaration, or to receive assistance through a declaration for a state. Prior to being amended, the Stafford Act mandated requests for an emergency or major disaster declaration by the president could only be made by the governor of the affected state. The Stafford Act now clearly reflects federally recognized tribal government status as sovereign nations, giving them the same status as states when requesting federal disaster assistance. The Stafford Act is particularly important because some states could not readily work with federally recognized tribes under their state constitution and laws. This could create obstacles in the emergency response and recovery process. For example, prior to the change, to receive federal disaster assistance, the governor had to activate the state's emergency plan and demonstrate that state and local capabilities in the affected areas were insufficient. Depending on the tribe's status and applicable state law, the governor may not have had independent authority to take such actions with respect to tribal lands. Now, federally recognized tribes have the same status as states, removing legal barriers from developing stronger relationships with the federal government while allowing tribes to directly request federal assistance. The Stafford Act now allows consideration of all of a tribe's affected land in one request, even if the lands cross state lines. Before the Stafford Act amendment, an affected tribal government had to submit a separate request to the governor of each state within which the tribe's lands were located to request an emergency or major disaster declaration. It is important to note that the breadth and scope of the application of the Stafford Act amendment can be affected by agency policy as well as federal case law. For example, staff at Oils are analyzing the effects of the recent Supreme Court decision in McGirt. This is because this case has fundamentally adjusted how we view the reservation and Indian land status of the 5 tribes here in Oklahoma. Now let's talk about the phases of disaster. Disasters are recurring events and are typically thought of in the emergency management and response community as occurring in a cycle. The phases are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, both early and long term. Every community in the world is in one of these stages at all times. The preparedness phase includes activities designed to get a community ready for events that cannot be prevented or mitigated prior to their occurrence, such as planning, training, and preparedness exercises. The goal is to prepare before an emergency happens. Preparing empowers response and takes place at many levels. After disaster strikes comes the response phase, sometimes called rescue or emergency phase. This phase can be a very dangerous environment and includes actions that help protect lives and property during a disaster. This is when you would first see first responders. First responders in the emergency phase will be local fire and police departments, search and rescue teams, emergency medical services, and services offering feeding and sheltering. Others who may initially respond include family, neighbors, churches, and community-based organizations. Next comes the recovery phase. This phase includes how we build back after disaster, repairing, rebuilding, and restoring the community to its pre-emergency condition as best as we can. We typically divide recovery into early and long-term phases. In early recovery, individuals and communities are making an inventory of damages, contacting their insurance companies, and applying for federal, state, and local assistance programs. This is the phase when early cleanup, chainsaw and tarping teams, often from voluntary organizations, are involved in temporary stabilization of property. This is also the period of time when government and voluntary agencies begin meeting the basic food, clothing, and shelter needs of the community through feeding, sheltering, and other mass distribution operations. Some agencies will begin laying the groundwork for long-term recovery with outreach and casework activities. This is also when you would see donations, both financial and material, arriving in the community. In long-term recovery, typical activities include restoration of infrastructure and vital life support systems, resumption of the routines of daily life, and initiation of plans for permanent housing, repairing, rebuilding, or relocating of homes. This is also when case management generally begins and when clients with legal needs begin to emerge. As we'll see in a moment, the long-term recovery phase can be 100 times longer than the emergency or response phase. The mitigation phase includes projects to reduce future risks from hazards. These may be put in place before or after disaster, but they are always intended to improve conditions before the next event. Examples of mitigation include things like seawalls, flood channels, levees, and the purchase of insurance. Although recovery depends on many factors, such as the severity of the event and available resources within the community and beyond, and even how much news coverage an incident received relative to other news stories, in many disasters, we can think about the rule of tens. For the purpose of this illustration, we will be looking primarily at the three phases outlined in yellow on this slide: response, early recovery, and long-term recovery. The rule of tens formula doesn't apply to all disasters, and it doesn't give us exact numbers, but it does inform our general understanding of the anticipated timeline for recovery. The basic formula indicates that we can multiply the number of days required for the response phases by 10 to estimate the number of days required for early recovery, then multiply the number of days spent on early recovery to estimate the length of time required for long-term recovery. For example, in smaller disasters with an average amount of resources, the response or emergency or rescue phase may be 3 days long. Multiplying those 3 days by 10, we can see a 30-day anticipated period of early recovery. Multiply the 30 days of early recovery by 10 again, and that gives you 300 days anticipated as needed for long-term recovery. In the example shown on this slide, the response or emergency or rescue stage is 11 days. An example of an 11-day response or emergency phase would be the May 3rd, 1999 Central Oklahoma EF5 tornado. The final missing deceased victim in that disaster was found 11 days after the tornado. Using the rule of tens formula, we multiply the initial 11 days of response by 10 to see we can expect 110 days of early recovery. Indeed, due to the large scale of the May 3rd, 1999 tornado disaster, food and clothing distribution, early tarping, and initial debris removal took several months. Again, using the rule of tens, we multiply the 110 days of early recovery by 10 again to see we can expect 1,100 days of long-term recovery. Indeed, this was accurate in our example, as community recovery from the May 3rd, 1999 tornado actually did require 2.5 to 3 years. For our latest presidentially declared disaster, the severe storms, tornadoes, and flooding that impacted 7 Oklahoma counties between May 2nd and May 8th, 2022, the response lasted 7 days. Early recovery would then be projected to last 70 days, and long-term recovery anticipated to last 700 days. That means Oklahoma nonprofits, including LASO and Oils, will be assisting the communities impacted with recovery for almost 2 years. One thing to please note is this: if we look at this timeline in a pie chart format, we can see that although a great deal of media focus and community resources are centered upon the early days following a disaster, in reality, Long-term recovery typically requires much more time and effort from the community and agencies working to return the community to some sense of pre-disaster normalcy. Does Oklahoma have many disasters? In a word, yes. According to FEMA data, Oklahoma has received federal assistance for 210 disasters since 1953. According to U.S. News and World Report, Oklahoma City alone has been struck by 150 tornadoes since the 1890s and saw 5 tornadoes in just one day in 1974. In Oklahoma, we sometimes say we have experienced earth as an earthquake, wind as in high wind or tornadoes, fire as in wildfires, water, meaning too much, too little, or frozen, pandemic, and unfortunately, intentional infliction of mass casualties. Reverend Mary Hughes of Crisis Care Ministry has maintained a spreadsheet of disaster events requiring assistance from outside of the community in which the disaster occurred for several years. This chart shows that 35 disasters have impacted Oklahoma since May of 2013, 6 of which were severe enough to warrant a presidential disaster declaration and the award of individual assistance to survivors. If you take into account that some of these events occurred over multiple days with multiple disaster events, like 4 tornadoes over 5 days, then as of November 2022, the average period of time between disaster events in Oklahoma was 92 days. In addition to having many disaster incidents, Oklahoma is also amongst the poorest states in America. Let's talk about how poverty and disaster frequency impacts Oklahoma, Oklahomans, and survivor recovery from disasters. Poverty is rampant in Oklahoma. In 2021, over 570,000 Oklahomans lived below poverty level. That's 14.3% of Oklahoma's population. At a rate of 14.3% poverty, Oklahoma is number 8 in the list of the top 10 poorest states in the U.S. The U.S. poverty rate in 2021 was 12.4%, meaning Oklahoma's poverty rate of 14.3% is higher than the national average. In fact, Oklahoma's poverty rate has exceeded the national average every year since 2008. In 2021, 200% of federal poverty was an income of $25,760 or less for an individual, $34,840 for a family of 2, and $53,000 for a family of 4. Oklahoma is largely a rural state. Of Oklahoma's 77 counties, 60 are considered by the USDA and the Office of Management and Budget to be rural. Why does the rural nature of most of Oklahoma matter? It matters because poverty rates are much higher in rural and small town Oklahoma than in the major metro areas of Oklahoma. Poverty in rural and small town Oklahoma is 17.9%. In the major metro areas, it's 14.3%. Poverty rates are higher among children than among any other age group in Oklahoma. Almost 1 in 5 Oklahoma children, 19.9%, live in a household with income below the poverty line. Almost 1 in 3 Oklahomans living in poverty are in single mother households. 1 in 4 are in married couple households. And the poverty rate is highest amongst those who did not complete high school at 27.2%, and lowest for adults with a college degree at 4.2%. We've now looked at the Oklahoma poverty statistics and the chart showing how often Oklahoma is impacted by disaster events. This leads us to the terrible scenario of when disasters impact people already living in poverty. Low-income families are disproportionately impacted by natural disasters. Why is that? It's because people who have more resources tend to move away from disaster-prone areas. Low-income people are also more likely to live in lower quality housing that will suffer more damage in a disaster event. Low-income people also have fewer resources at their disposal to help them protect themselves against disaster impact or to assist them in their recovery. Regarding that low-income people have fewer resources available to help themselves recover, many elderly people live on fixed incomes below poverty level. If they have a home and get it paid off, they often drop their homeowner's insurance once their mortgage company no longer requires it because they can't afford to pay for that and to pay for their medicines they need or for food. That is not a figurative example. In 2013, I heard that story more than once from elderly people in Moore. Also, it is difficult for low-income people to save money. As the saying goes, it is expensive to be poor. when you're paying higher interest rates, can't prepay for premiums to get discounts, etc. And again, low interest small business administration loans, which again are not restricted solely to businesses, but may also be accessed by individuals and nonprofits, may be available after some disasters, both declared and undeclared, to help people rebuild. However, low-income people may have too small of an income to be deemed able to repay the loan, may have very little credit history, or may have credit that is not good enough to help them qualify for the loan. Here we see our latest Oklahoma declared disaster, the 2022 severe storms, tornadoes, and floods that occurred between May 2nd and May 8th, 2022. 7 Oklahoma counties were declared as eligible to receive FEMA individual assistance. Over 3,800 FEMA registrations were received, over 3,200 of those from designated counties. Here is a map from FEMA showing in green the counties receiving FEMA individual assistance for the May 2022 disaster. Here we see a slide about the disaster in 2021, the severe winter storm in February. This was the deep freeze, snow and ice event that also impacted Texas and Louisiana. Damage reports from every Oklahoma county were received by Oklahoma Emergency Management. 17 counties listed here were declared as eligible for FEMA individual assistance. Again, we have a FEMA map. The counties in pink were the ones declared eligible for FEMA individual assistance for that disaster event. We've now looked at the Oklahoma poverty statistics, the chart showing how Oklahoma is impacted very often by disaster events. Now let's talk about what disaster recovery generally looks like in Oklahoma and who and what agencies are generally involved. Before we go any further, I would like to talk to you about VOAD, or Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. What is VOAD? Well, again, VOAD stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. We have national VOAD as well as state, territorial, and in some cases, regional and local VOADs. National VOAD was founded over 50 years ago in response to the challenges many disaster organizations experienced following Hurricane Camille, a Category 5 storm that hit the Gulf Coast in August 1969. Until that time, numerous governmental, private sector, and nonprofit organizations served disaster survivors independently of one another. As a result, help often came to survivors haphazardly. Unnecessary duplication of effort often occurred, while at the same time, other needs were not met. People who wanted to volunteer to help their neighbors affected by disaster were often frustrated by the variety of organizations competing in some areas of service, or the total lack of opportunities to serve other apparently urgent needs. Further, there was only limited availability to training for potential volunteers. Access to information on services available to survivors during disasters was woefully inadequate. Likewise, communication among voluntary disaster agencies and coordination of services was negligible. In fact, mechanisms for this were non-existent. In 1970, 7 national disaster response organizations convened for the first time to find a way to better coordinate responses and more effectively serve disaster survivors in their communities. As an outcome, National VOAD was formed as a forum for sharing knowledge and coordinating resources, money, materials, and people power throughout the disaster cycle. Since National VOAD's founding, many lessons have been learned, skills developed, and best practices shared. This resulted in the establishment of a commitment to shared values, the 4 C's: communication, coordination, collaboration, and cooperation, as guiding principles for how National VOAD operates and resolves conflict, as well as various points of consensus and other protocols for guiding the work of individual member organizations and the collective efforts of the collaborative. All National VOAD members agree to adhere to such standards of conduct and service delivery developed and approved by the membership. By the end of the 1970s, many other organizations had joined the National VOAD movement. During the 1980s, many local affiliates of National VOAD members began forming local, regional, and state VOADs. By the mid-1990s, VOAD had become a true national movement. Today, National VOAD is a coalition of dozens of the nation's most reputable national organizations, faith-based, community-based, and other nonprofits, and state and territory VOADs, which represent local regional VOADs, and hundreds of other member organizations throughout the country. In the interest of full disclosure, I will share with you that I am currently a member of the board of directors of National VOAD and am a past chair of Oklahoma VOAD. I believe very strongly in the work done by National VOAD and Oklahoma VOAD. What is Oklahoma VOAD? Oklahoma VOAD is a consortium of organizations that serve in various roles in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Oklahoma VOAD's purpose is to bring together organizations active in disaster services in an effort to foster more effective response to the people of Oklahoma. Oklahoma VOAD was established as a state VOAD pursuant to the National VOAD Guidelines and is a nonpartisan, membership-based organization that builds resiliency in Oklahoma communities. Oklahoma VOAD is comprised largely of faith-based, non-faith-based government and community partners and brings together voluntary organizations active in disaster services in an effort to foster more effective response to the people of Oklahoma in times of disaster. Oklahoma VOAD serves as the forum wherein organizations share knowledge and resources throughout the disaster cycle. Oklahoma VOAD members provide the leadership that builds strong, resilient communities and delivers hope in times of need. The work of Oklahoma VOAD occurs through a strong and active committee structure in 11 different areas listed here. These committees correspond to committees also found in National VOAD. Through work in those areas, VOAD establishes best practices and points of consensus. In the wake of a disaster event, a state or local government may request that Oklahoma VOAD agencies participate in recovery from the disaster event. Once a request is received for Oklahoma VOAD membership support, Oklahoma VOAD follows their activation plan by bringing members together via conference call, webinar, or email to learn more about the emergency response, to discuss and evaluate the needs of survivors, to identify the resources available to service those needs within the Oklahoma VOAD agencies, and to coordinate delivery of those services so resources reach the right places, impact the people who need them the most, and are not duplicative. Oklahoma VOAD leadership coordinates with the state of Oklahoma Emergency Management to keep the state EM aware of resources on the ground and to keep the VOAD membership informed about overall recovery operations. This work also aids in developing much needed relationships between each organization that allow for direct and open lines of communication. To be clear, Oklahoma VOAD itself is not operational. However, Oklahoma VOAD agencies are operational in times of disaster recovery. Now that we've discussed VOAD, I'd like to focus again on how disaster response and recovery is generally handled in Oklahoma. Here again is our chart with the phases of disaster. As a disaster incident occurs, the response stage begins. Early in response, or the emergency stage, in addition to first responders, Oklahoma's local, county, and state emergency managers will be active. What are emergency managers? The official definition from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that emergency management directors prepare plans and procedures for responding to natural disasters and other emergencies. They also help lead the response during and after emergencies, often in coordination with public safety officials, elected officials, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies. Each of Oklahoma's 77 counties are required by statute to have an emergency manager. In addition, each town within each county also likely has an emergency manager, which may be the chief of police or the chief of the fire department. Further, many of the sovereign tribal nations in Oklahoma also have their own emergency manager. The Oklahoma Emergency Management Department prepares for, responds to, recovers from, and mitigates against disasters and emergencies. The department maintains the State Emergency Operations Center, which serves as a command center for reporting emergencies and coordinating state response activities. OEM delivers service to Oklahoma cities, towns, and counties through the network of more than 300 local emergency managers. OEM also maintains, regularly updates, and exercises the State Emergency Operations Plan. The department provides funding and/or assistance to local emergency managed departments throughout the state as well. As the situation begins to emerge and we move into the early recovery phases after a disaster incident, local emergency management personnel in impacted areas may ask Oklahoma VOAD to open a multi-agency resource center, or MARC. A MARC is a central hub in a disaster impacted area which serves as a single one-stop shop location where public and private organizations come together to provide assistance to those affected by disaster. Although voluntary agencies are active in individual operations, the first visible sign of a whole Oklahoma-wide activity following a disaster event in Oklahoma is likely a mark. Marks are designed to expedite individual, family, and community recovery following a disaster. They provide efficient, collective, and effective assistance to individuals and families affected by a disaster in a single one-stop location, minimizing the time and travel distance needed for affected individuals and families to obtain assistance after a disaster. Marks also aid in reunification of family and friends, and maximize the use of collective resources and expedite the ability of organizations to deliver services by eliminating the need for participating organizations to set up individual assistance centers and facilitating coordination and information sharing between participating organizations. Marks also enable effective coordination with government and non-government agencies and facilitate the transition to long-term recovery. Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma and Oklahoma Indian Legal Services have been present in dozens of marks over the past few years to screen survivors for any possible developing civil legal issues that may frustrate their recovery process and to disseminate information to survivors on how to avoid common post-disaster civil legal issues before they have a chance to develop. In the past few years, LASO and OILS have assisted hundreds of disaster-impacted Oklahomans. However, there are always more people who need assistance than there are resources. As we look again at our timeline of disaster response and recovery, we move into long-term recovery. Long-term recovery is that time following a disaster in which agencies and organizations help affected persons and communities to develop and implement plans and structures for an extended recovery over a period of time. Recovery is unique in every disaster, and long-term recovery can and sometimes does last many weeks or years. What happens during long-term recovery? That's when transition occurs between the presence of national organizations and the local community. At that time, implementation begins for disaster case management and recovery initiatives administered by the local community. Construction activities start to include repairing, rebuilding, and/or relocating of homes. This phase also is characterized by the resumption of the routines of daily life. Human, material, and financial resources come into a community after a disaster, but public awareness diminishes over time. A strong, well-organized long-term recovery group can ensure that available resources are utilized so as to address recovery needs. This graphic depicts the sequence of assistance and service delivery following a disaster event. Sequence of assistance is the order in which disaster assistance programs are arranged. Following the sequence of delivery of assistance allows disaster-affected individuals and families to maximize the amount of assistance they receive and helps avoid potentially illegal duplication of benefits. Looking more closely at the sequence, we see that in the response phase, voluntary organizations are active providing emergency food, shelter, clothing, medical needs, and cleanup. In the early relief phase, we see individuals accessing any insurance benefits they may have, like renters, homeowners, or flood. Following maximizing their available insurance options, individuals can access FEMA programs if the disaster has been declared and FEMA is available. FEMA benefits can include grant funding to help provide temporary housing, home repair, medical and dental needs, and funeral expenses. In addition, small business administration programs may also be available even when a disaster is not declared. If a disaster is declared and individuals are denied SBA, FEMA other needs assistance may also be available. Those benefits can include grant funding to assist with replacing personal property, moving and storage expenses, transportation expenses, and group flood insurance. In the long-term recovery phase, volunteer organizations are active providing long-term disaster-related unmet needs, likely through local long-term recovery groups. What is a long-term recovery group? After a disaster event, human, material, and financial resources may dwindle with decreasing public awareness. To assist impacted residents, affected communities may choose to form what is known as a long-term recovery group, or LTRG. A LTRG is a vehicle that enables a community and its residents to work together toward recovery from a disaster event. LTRGs utilize disaster case management services, which we will examine in a moment, to identify and verify the disaster-related unmet needs of individuals and households impacted by the disaster. Organizations with money, materials, and people power come together at one table as a group to hear the unmet needs of individuals and families being assisted, presented by disaster case management. A strong, well-organized long-term recovery group can maximize the utilization of available resources to address recovery needs. Additionally, the incorporation of mitigating activities into a community's recovery process may reduce future loss and impact. Who organizes a long-term recovery group? In Oklahoma, typically the VOAD, when asked by the local community, will assist the community with an informational meeting about what a long-term recovery group is and does. However, as all disasters begin and end in the local community, the goal is to have local people lead the LTRG. Oklahoma VOAD may help convene the group and help it find its way by offering sample flyers, emails, and scripts for outreach, but the group does need to be community driven. Who needs to be at a long-term recovery table? Community services like food banks, social and human services, businesses, government agencies, tribal entities, voluntary agencies, faith communities, civic groups, and mental health organizations and providers. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about disaster case management. Disaster case management is a time-limited process by which a skilled helper partners with a disaster-affected individual or family in order to plan for and achieve realistic goals for recovery following a disaster. In Oklahoma, typically a voluntary agency involved with VOAD will provide case management services following a disaster event. The case managers at that agency will work in partnership with a disaster-impacted individual or family to assess their needs, help them form a recovery plan, and assist them with walking through the sequence of assistance we learned about earlier and the steps of their individual plan. Recovery plans are client-driven. Case managers help, but do not move the plan forward for the client. The client must do that themselves. Case managers work to help identify personal resources of the client, including insurance, savings, FEMA benefits, and potential SBA benefits. They also work to identify disaster-related needs that need to be addressed in order for the client to reach a new normal. The case managers can also work to identify community resources that match disaster unmet needs the client has. If a family still has needs that cannot be met after personal resources and any available federal resources, if those are available, a case manager can present the unmet needs of that client to the local long-term recovery group for consideration. Organizations involved maintain their respective roles and responsibilities and agree to collaborate in bringing those resources to that unified LTRG collaborative process. Again, all projects are presented to the LTRG by a disaster case manager. The concerned individual or family is not present. Those who have been gathered to be part of the LTRG have individual agency autonomy. Representatives will obligate their own agency or organization to all or part of the money, material, or people power the project will require. The process of presenting unmet needs to the LTRG continues until the client project receives enough resources for completion or resources have been exhausted. Here we have an example of a sample case presentation form. The client identifying information is not disclosed, and participants of the LTRG do sign confidentiality agreements prior to hearing cases. So why is legal assistance critical for disaster survivors? After a disaster event, it is not necessarily intuitive for a survivor to think, I better find a lawyer, or for lawyers to think, I bet those survivors need legal help. You know, I should contact LASO or OILS and offer to volunteer. It is very common for disaster survivors to not realize a problem that they are having is legal in nature and for them to need legal assistance in the wake of a disaster event. There are issues experienced by survivors for which the only available remedy may be legal in nature. If left unresolved, those issues can frustrate or prevent survivors from recovering from a disaster event and reaching their new normal. I have to say, Oklahoma is incredibly fortunate to have an extremely strong disaster response and recovery community. Sadly, practice has really honed the skills of and the relationships between agencies. and a really stellar group of social services agencies, faith-based groups, Oklahoma Emergency Management, and more come together to speed resources to where they are needed. As all of these groups converge to help disaster-impacted persons, 2 legal services organizations are also preparing to help disaster survivors. Free civil legal services in Oklahoma are provided by 2 programs funded by the Legal Services Corporation. Those programs are Oklahoma Indian Legal Services and Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma. To be eligible for LASO legal assistance, a client must be living at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. To be eligible for OILS legal assistance, a client must live in Oklahoma, be living at or below 200% of federal poverty guidelines, and be an enrolled member of one of the state's federally recognized tribes. There are occasions when OILS will serve members other federally recognized tribes who happen to live here in Oklahoma. LASO and OILS strive to help income-eligible Oklahomans prepare for, survive, and recover from disasters. LASO and OILS do so by serving their legal needs and collaborating with volunteer service organizations through all stages of the disaster cycle. LASO and OILS participate in disaster response by cooperating, communicating, coordinating, and collaborating with our Oklahoma partner organizations, state agency and tribal governmental partners, and bar association partners to help our clients and communities recover from disaster. LASO and OILS participate in MARCs and disaster recovery centers if FEMA places disaster recovery centers in a community after a declared event. Both agencies are active members in Oklahoma VOAD, attend LTRG meetings, train case managers, accept case referrals from case management organizations, provide civil legal assistance, and train pro bono attorneys to assist disaster survivors. At this time, I'd like to talk about legal issues commonly experienced by disaster survivors. First, there are 37 sovereign tribal nations in Oklahoma, and tribal citizens can experience legal issues unique to tribal citizens and communities. Many restricted allotments with land titles are not brought up to date. Some clients are dealing with a mixture of restricted and fee land. Clients can have interaction with Tribal Realty, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Department of the Interior. And there are issues with restricted Indian land and non-restricted home sites. These are all issues that slow down the recovery process for tribal citizens and tribal communities. OILS staff work hard to help guide clients through the process to recover from the disaster event impacting their lives. So, regarding the most commonly seen post-disaster legal issues, replacing lost documents is a big issue after many disasters. Tornadoes, floods, and wildfires, all commonly occurring in Oklahoma, can destroy or relocate documents. Quickly replacing lost identification documents is especially important, as survivors will need identification to access many recovery resources. One tip we tell clients is to make copies or take pictures of identification and scan to a password-protected cloud-based storage service. That way, those copies are accessible following a disaster, no matter what happens to the originals. And again, having copies can help speed replacement or help speed access to post-disaster resources that might be available. Insurance issues is another big issue after disaster. Do you understand exactly what all of your insurance policies cover? Because if you said no, you are not alone, neither do many other people. Many survivors know they have insurance, but they aren't completely familiar with what that insurance covers or what benefits it will provide. Attorneys can help make sense of insurance documents and coverages. In some cases, a survivor may disagree with the settlement being offered by their insurance company. Attorneys can help the survivor negotiate with that company and help the survivor appeal that determination. In some cases, the survivor's insurance claim may have been denied. Again, an attorney can assist the survivor in appealing that decision with the insurance company. Housing issues following disaster are also very big issues in Oklahoma. A very common issue faced by homeowners following a disaster is the realization that they are not the owner of record of a family home. This is what is called the granny's house problem. The survivor may live in a family home passed down from a relative, but the probate wasn't ever taken care of and the title transferred into their name. Though they may have been the only heir, survivors cannot receive assistance funds for repairs from FEMA or from local recovery groups and nonprofits if they are not the owner of record of the home. This program is particularly critical for Native American persons who often need specialized assistance from attorneys, especially in the area of probate, due to often complex land ownership issues. Survivors in Oklahoma are lucky to have access to the attorneys at Oyles who specialize in legal issues impacting Native Americans. Another aspect of title issues is survivors purchasing their home pursuant to a contract for deed, commonly referred to in Oklahoma as rent to own. It is very difficult for these survivors to access most recovery resources related to home repair, as the agencies providing such funds may not recognize them as the homeowner. Even with an attorney, this issue is not often successfully resolved. In general, FEMA does not consider rent-to-own purchases as owners. Many survivors also may have lost their job as a result of the disaster and are consequently unable to pay their mortgage. They may need help working with mortgage companies to prevent foreclosure or assistance with declaring bankruptcy. Obviously, there are myriad consumer issues a survivor could encounter following a disaster that could require the services of an attorney. And those listed here are only listed because they are the consumer issues we most commonly see following a disaster event. Survivors often need to hire contractors to assist them with repairs to their homes. Disasters can be traumatizing for survivors, and those survivors are often preyed upon by unscrupulous contractors or persons pretending to be contractors who come to their home after the event. For example, after the 2013 EF5 tornado in Moore, Oklahoma, there were individuals who went to Moore and told families that if the family gave them their entire insurance check up front, instead of following a more standardized drawdown plan, the contractor would put that family at the top of their list to rebuild and repair their home and would have them back in their home faster. Some families who were devastated and just wanted to get back to normal as quickly as possible did so, and the contractor either never started or never finished their repairs, leaving them with no insurance money and no home. In those cases, a survivor may need an attorney to assist them in an action against the contractor. Some cases should be referred to the Attorney General's Office for investigation. This area is one in which an ounce of prevention is the best medicine. The best thing a survivor can do is to make sure there is a written contract for the work to be performed, including the cost of repairs, materials, and a completion date. The survivor needs to understand all the terms in the contract too. Over the years, survivors have brought their contractor-related issues to LASO, and LASO attorneys have reviewed many contracts to make sure the contract protected the survivor before it was signed. After the 2019 floods, LASO attorneys also saw issues develop between survivors and the providers of moving and storage services and RV sales. Survivors in rental properties following a disaster may face issues like the rental unit needing repairs after the event, and the landlord will not make the repairs, but also may refuse the tenant the ability to move out. Those tenants need advice on their legal options regarding terminating their lease or rental agreement and may need assistance getting back their security deposit. In addition, renters may also have issues with renters' insurance denials or underpayments from their insurance company. Disaster events can also lead to family law issues. The aftermath of a disaster can be very stressful, and it is not uncommon to see an increase in domestic violence events following a disaster. Disaster events can also lead to emergency custody actions. For example, a non-custodial parent may seek custody if they believe their child no longer has stable housing as a result of the disaster event. Disasters can also cause loss of employment, and actions to modify child support by parents who have lost their jobs is also common. Sadly, often guardianships over a child or adult can also be needed after a disaster event if the parent or original guardian lost their life during the event. Inheritance issues and probate issues can also arise for survivors, such as the ownership of property issues mentioned previously. Guardianships after disaster are an Oyles priority. Uncontested or voluntary guardianships involving minor Indian children, where applicant is Indian custodian with physical custody of ward by consent of the natural parents. Disasters can result in the loss of a survivor's employment. For example, the business at which they work may have been destroyed. Those survivors often need assistance with questions, applications, or appeals regarding unemployment benefits. Disaster survivors may need help determining their eligibility and applying for various benefits following an event like FEMA, Social Security disability, Medicaid, food stamps, or unemployment. As touched on before, those survivors may have only questions, may need help applying, or could need help with appeals. With FEMA funding, disaster survivors may be informed that they were overpaid or did not spend their funds properly and need assistance with a recoupment action. These are the common legal problems experienced by those impacted by disaster. However, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many other legal problems that can occur. So when do the typical post-disaster legal issues start to arise? In the first 1 to 6 weeks after the event, we commonly answer landlord-tenant questions, assist survivors in understanding their insurance coverages and in filing their claims, assist FEMA clients with FEMA applications, SBA applications, and assist clients with document replacement, benefit applications like for unemployment, SNAP, food stamps, Medicaid, or SSI. In the first month to 6 months after the event, we may see denials of FEMA benefits, evictions, utility cutoffs, foreclosures, trying to attempt foreclosure prevention, see displaced public housing clients. We may clear property titles, assist with insurance claim disputes, assist with contractor repair scams and disputes, assist with guardianships and powers of attorney, and assist clients with domestic violence issues. From 6 months to years after the event, we can see foreclosures, bankruptcies, assist with flood insurance proof of loss and FEMA flood directorate appeals, defend against FEMA recoupment actions, assist with civil and disability rights cases, and assist with home elevation certificate and floodplain zoning disputes. So having heard how critical civil legal services are to Oklahomans who have survived a disaster event, I know you are wondering how you as a law student can help, and we need your help as LASO and OILS aren't able to help every Oklahoman who needs this vital assistance. Since we are unable to fully assist everyone, LASO and OILS prioritize certain cases such as domestic violence cases and evictions. We refer those we are not able to assist to private attorneys who accept cases for full representation. We also refer cases to outreach clinics where private attorneys volunteer to provide document drafting or advice. We also have attorneys who prefer to provide legal advice from their office or home. For example, OILS has put on several very successful remote attorney access events like Drive Up, Ask a Lawyer events during the COVID pandemic. Of course, we understand that not all attorneys are able to provide services due to a prohibition by their employer or simply due to lack of time. How can you help survivors in Oklahoma? As a law student, you can volunteer to help at a MARC or a recovery clinic, or you can become an intern at LASO or OILS and help with cases. When you become a member of the bar in Oklahoma or in another jurisdiction, you can take a case or mentor or co-counsel on cases, give advice at a legal clinic, speak to groups, or help teach clinics and workshops. In Oklahoma, there is an ethics rule concerning conflicts of interest that pertain to attorneys volunteering for a program sponsored by a nonprofit or court. Rule 6.5 lists the instances in which conflicts will be excused. As long as services provided is short-term limited legal services, no expectation by either the lawyer or the client that the lawyer will provide continuing representation in the matter, and the lawyer was not aware that a conflict of interest existed for the lawyer or a member of the lawyer's firm. Many disaster-related pro bono opportunities currently exist at LASO and OILS. You can see there listed our 2022 disaster, 2021 disaster. We still have cases. We are working from the 2019 flood disaster. There are also numerous OILS outreach events and LASO clinics. As far as disaster resources, we do have a new website. LASO and OILS have collaborated on a new statewide disaster legal help website. The site contains important information about past and ongoing disaster events and recoveries. FEMA application information, includes all LASO and OILS disaster resources, and an online application for services. A pro bono attorney portal that will allow pro bono attorneys to view, select, and document pro bono cases referred from either program will also be launched in 2023. LASO and OILS also have a variety of resources available to assist disaster survivors on the website, including flyers on renters' rights after a disaster, replacing important documents after a disaster, a disaster insurance claim tip sheet, and a tip sheet on hiring a contractor after a disaster. OILS has also created a disaster preparedness checklist to help Oklahomans become more resilient to disaster events. as well as an information card detailing available services for survivors. Again, these resources and many more may be downloaded from oklahomadisasterlegalhelp.org. That is the conclusion of this presentation. My contact information is on the screen, as well as the contact information for Brian Candelaria at Oils. Please reach out to either of us if you have any questions or comments, if you would like to know more about disaster legal services in Oklahoma, or if you would be interested in volunteering to help disaster survivors. Thank you so much for your time today.